folder came out of a regional archive in Khabarovsk that nobody had any reason to look at in almost 30 years. It had been mislabeled in the chaotic months of 1993 when local KGB offices across the Russian Far East were transferring their paperwork to the newly created Federal Counterintelligence Service, and most of it ended up filed under whatever broad category seemed least likely to attract attention. A graduate student from a European university researching Soviet-era forestry policy in Primorsky Krai pulled a folder marked Environmental Compliance and Land Use Reports in the spring of 2021. What she found inside did not pertain to forestry. It was a stack of operational reports, surveillance summaries, biological assessments, and after-action briefings spanning 22 years. From June of 1969 through August of 1991. The reports documented a sustained, well-resourced, and ultimately failed effort by the Soviet state security apparatus to capture, contain, or kill an animal that the field officers called the lesnoy chelovek, the forest man, and that any American who has spent time reading DOGMAN witness accounts would recognize within the first 3 pages. So before we continue, make sure you subscribe and let us know where you are watching from. Thanks. We obtained a portion of those documents through a researcher in Berlin who works on Soviet-era declassified materials. We also interviewed twice by encrypted video call the man who served as the operations field commander from 1973 through its termination. He agreed to speak on the condition that we change his name and withhold any identifying details about his current location or family. Given the climate in Russia regarding disclosure of historical state security activities, those conditions were not negotiable. We are calling him Victor. Victor is in his early 80s now. He was a young KGB officer when he was first assigned to the operation in the summer of 1973. 4 years after it began under a predecessor we are calling Anatoly, who died in the mid-90s and whose family is still living. Victor ran the operation for the next 18 years, overseeing personnel, equipment, indigenous guides, and the construction of 3 semi-permanent field stations in the Sikhote-Alin foothills and the southern Stanovoy. He saw the lesnoy chelovek with his own eyes on at least 4 separate occasions. He has photographs that he will not share, audio recordings that he will not release, and a memory that has not faded in the 35 years since the operation ended, because what he witnessed in the Sikhote-Alin taiga during the spring of 1978 is not the kind of thing a person forgets. The Sikhote-Alin mountain range runs roughly 1,200 kilometers along the Pacific coast of the Russian Far East, from the lower Amur River in the north to the area around Vladivostok in the south. The range is the heart of one of the last great temperate forests on Earth, an ecosystem that escaped the last ice age more or less intact and that today supports populations of Amur tigers, Amur leopards, Asian black bears, brown bears, lynx, sable, wolverine, and red deer in numbers that no other forest in the world can match. The Sikhote-Alin State Nature Reserve was established in 1935 to protect sable that had been hunted nearly to extinction by Russian trappers in the 1800s. It now covers nearly 4,000 square kilometers of essentially untouched taiga and mixed forest. Steep volcanic ridges, cold rivers running through deep valleys choked with Korean pine, Manchurian fir, and dwarf birch. Snow on the high ground from October through May. Bears nearly everywhere. Tigers in the lower elevations. And according to the operational reports Victor's team compiled over 22 years, something else. The operation began on June 14, 1969, in response to an incident in the taiga north of the town of Terny, on the Beacon River drainage in Primorsky Krai. 2 members of a Soviet Army survey unit conducting preliminary mapping for a proposed military road encountered something one of them reported to his superiors and the other refused to discuss for the rest of his life. The report, filed by a senior sergeant with the local military command, described an upright canid roughly 2 meters in height that crossed the unit's camp at approximately 3 a.m, paused at the entrance of one of the sleeping tents long enough that the sergeant on watch could see the silhouette of the head against the firelight, and departed into the forest at a speed that the sergeant estimated to be well above what any quadruped could sustain on rough ground. The report would have been filed under unusual wildlife observation and forgotten, except that it landed on the desk of a deputy commander who had been a junior officer attached to the Snowman Commission of 1958, the brief Soviet Academy of Sciences expedition to the Pamir Mountains in search of relict hominoids. That commission had been disbanded after producing no usable evidence, but a small number of officers and scientists who had participated remained convinced that the underlying phenomenon was real, and that the failure of the Pamir expedition reflected poor methodology rather than the absence of the subject animal. The deputy commander forwarded the survey unit's report through channels that bypassed the academy and routed it to a small interagency working group out of Khabarovsk, under nominal cover of the KGB's regional administration. The 5th Chief Directorate had been formally established in Moscow only months earlier, in July of 1969, and its mandate was the suppression of political and ideological dissent. But the regional administrations in the Far East had broader latitude than their counterparts in European Russia, and the working group that received the file drew personnel from the regional KGB, from Soviet military intelligence, and from the Far Eastern branch of the Academy of Sciences. The operation carried no public designation and no public budget. Internally, the reports refer to it only by a numerical designator that we have agreed not to print, because it would allow Russian intelligence services to identify the specific archive folder from which our materials came. By the autumn of 1969, the team had documented 11 separate track sites along a 60-kilometer stretch of the Bikin and its tributaries. They had cast plaster impressions of 17 distinct tracks ranging in length from 28 to 36 centimeters, showing canid foot morphology with 4 toe pads and prominent claws, but a bipedal gait pattern that no known canid produces. They had collected hair samples from 3 trees showing what they classified as territorial rubbing behavior, with the samples submitted to an Academy of Sciences laboratory in Leningrad for analysis. The laboratory's preliminary report, dated November of 1969, stated that the hair did not match any catalogued mammal in the Institute's reference collection. The report did not speculate further. Soviet science under Brezhnev was not a field that rewarded speculation. That hair analysis is one of the documents in our possession. 2 academic Russian speakers translated it independently and reached substantially identical conclusions. The lab found that the hair was consistent with a large mammal of the order Carnivora, that it was neither canid, ursid, nor felid in its keratin structure, that the cuticle pattern showed irregularities not present in any reference sample from Eurasian fauna, and that the medulla was occupied by a continuous core of a type the technicians had seen only in primate hair samples. The conclusion was hedged in the way Soviet scientific documents hedged sensitive findings. It said the samples warranted further analysis. It did not say what they were. By the spring of 1970, the operation had been formally chartered with a budget, a staff of 14, and a directive to identify, locate, and ideally capture alive an example of the animal responsible for the tracks, the hair, and what by then was a growing file of witness reports. The team Anatoly assembled included 2 biologists from the Academy's Far Eastern branch, 3 KGB officers, a former GRU officer with extensive long-range patrolling experience, a Soviet Army major from the border guards, and 6 indigenous men recruited locally as guides and trackers. 5 of the 6 were Udege. The 6th was an Evenki hunter named in the reports only by a patronymic and a code designation, a man we are calling Innocenti at Victor's request. because Innocenti's nephews and grandchildren are still alive in the Sikote Alin foothills, and Victor does not want them visited by anyone in the current Russian state security apparatus. The Udege are one of the smallest indigenous nations of the Russian Far East. By the time the operation began, there were fewer than 2,000 of them, concentrated in a handful of villages along the Bekin and Iman river basins. The cultural center of the Bekin Udege is the village of Krasny Yar, which still exists today and which has been at the heart of the long fight to protect the Bekin watershed from logging. The Udege are a Tungusic people, related linguistically and culturally to the Nanai, Orochi, Evenki, and Even. Their traditional way of life centered on hunting and fishing in the dense Korean pine forests of the central Sikote Alin, with a cosmology that recognized the tiger and the brown bear as ancestors and that maintained specific protocols for interacting with the spirits of the forest. They were the people the operation selected as guides because no one else in the Soviet Union knew that country the way the Udege knew it. What the planners did not anticipate, and what Victor's reports document in increasing frustration, was that the Udege knew exactly what the operation was looking for, and they had specific cultural protocols about how to interact with it. And those protocols did not include leading a team of armed Soviet officers to its dens. Victor arrived in Khabarovsk in May of 1973. He was in his late 20s, a graduate of the KGB's higher school in Moscow, with 3 years of experience in counterintelligence work in the Baltic republics. He had asked for the Far East posting because the Baltic work had been bureaucratic in a way that did not suit him. He did not know what operation he was being assigned to until his second week, when Anatoly took him to a secure room in the regional administration building and showed him the files. Victor told us he sat at a wooden table for the better part of a day reading reports, examining photographs of plaster castings, looking at hair sample analyses. He did not believe any of it until Anatoly took him to a Soviet Army storage facility that evening and showed him what the operation had managed to recover during its first 4 years. The facility held 11 plaster casts of tracks, each documented with photographs and field notes. It held the desiccated remains of what one of the biologists had identified as a partial scapula, recovered from a riverbank in the southern Stanovoy in the autumn of 1971, that could not be matched to any known mammal of the region. It held a single piece of dark fur mounted on a glass slide, and it held a reel of 16mm film that Anatoly threaded into a projector and showed Victor in a darkened room, while the major from the border guards watched the corridor outside. The film had been recorded in the late summer of 1972, from a hide built into the slope above a creek bottom about 15 kilometers east of the Beacon River. It runs for perhaps a minute and a half. What it shows is something walking on 2 legs across a sandbar where the creek bends in late afternoon. Light filtered through the canopy. The figure is at considerable distance, perhaps 200 meters from the camera, and the resolution combined with the haze of summer afternoon means that the image is partly degraded. But the silhouette is unmistakable, upright, broad through the shoulders, arms that hang past the hips. The head extends forward into a profile that is not human and not bear and not anything else in the Soviet fauna handbook. It stops at the water, lowers its head briefly, then turns and walks into the screen of alder on the far bank. Victor told us that when the film ended, Anatoly sat for a long moment in the dark before he switched on the lights. Then Anatoly said something Victor has never forgotten. He said the operation had been hunting this animal for 4 years and had not gotten within 2 kilometers of one. He said the animal knew the operation was hunting it, that it understood the difference between a guide who was Udege and a guide who was Russian, and that the operation was not catching a wild animal. The operation was trying to outthink something that had been outthinking humans in those forests for longer than anyone could calculate. If you have spent any time in the country east of Khabarovsk, or anywhere in the Russian Far East taiga between the Amur River and the Sea of Okhotsk, you know the kind of landscape Viktor's team was working in. Vast, dense, cold, almost empty of people once you move off the railroad lines and the major rivers. Let us know in the comments if you have ever spent time in eastern Siberia or read about that country, because the geography matters to what comes next. Viktor's first field deployment was in October of 1973 to the Upper Beacon Drainage. He went out with the major from the border guards, 2 Udege guides, and Inokenti. The party traveled by motorboat up the Beacon from Krasny Yar, then on foot into the side valleys where the operation had documented track sites in previous years. Viktor told us he carried a Makarov pistol and a Mosin Nagant carbine, and that within an hour of leaving the boats he understood that the firearms were not the point. The point was observation. The point was to spend enough days in country to develop a feel for the terrain and the animal's habits. They did not see the animal on that first trip. They saw sign. The major showed Viktor how to recognize the way the creature marked trees, with diagonal claw gouges set high on conifers, usually red pines at heights between 2 and 2.5 meters off the ground. The major showed him how to read tracks in the sandy washes along the creek bottoms. The major showed him the difference between a brown bear's track and what the operation called the subject's track. Brown bear tracks register the bear's full plantigrade foot, with the heel pad clearly separated from the toes. The subject's track showed a canid digitigrade structure, with toe pads forward of a heel pad that did not extend back the way a bear's does. The toes were longer than a wolf's. The claw impressions were deeper. The overall track length was 30 centimeters or more, and the gait was unmistakable. The animal walked on 2 legs with a stride length of nearly 1.5 meters, impossible for any known canid and exceeding the stride length of any human under 2.5 meters in height. The Udege guides would not look at the tracks directly. Viktor noticed this on the second day when the major called him over to examine a particularly clear set of impressions in the wet sand at the edge of a side creek. The 2 Udege men stayed back at the edge of the trees, talking quietly to each other in their own language, not approaching. When Viktor asked the major what was going on, the major shook his head and said the Udege would not talk about it. They would lead the team to places where the animal had been because the operation paid them well, but they would not look at the tracks, would not handle anything the animal had touched, and would not under any circumstances follow tracks toward a den site. The major said this had been a constant frustration since 1969. The Udege knew where the animal lived. They would not say. They would lead the team along the periphery. The moment the team began to push toward what looked like a denning area, the Udege would develop sudden illnesses, recall pressing family obligations, or simply turn around and walk back to the river. Inokenti was different. Inokenti was Evenki, not Udege, and the Evenki traditions about the Lesnoy Chelovek were different from the Udege traditions, though both peoples acknowledged the animal's existence. Inokenti would talk about the animal when no Russian was within earshot, and Viktor, who had been raised in Leningrad but whose mother had taught Russian literature and who had a good ear for language, picked up enough Tungusic vocabulary during his years in the Far East to follow some of those conversations. The Evenki word Inokenti used for the animal was not Chuchuna, which is what the Yakut and some Evenki groups call the wild men of the northern tundra. The Lesnoy Chelovek of the eastern taiga was larger. It walked upright more often. Its head was canine, not human. The category that matches it most precisely in modern terms is the North American DOGMAN of contemporary research, and it had a relationship with humans that was older than the Tungusic peoples themselves. A relationship that involved territory, respect, and a set of mutual obligations that the Soviets, with their helicopters and their tracking equipment and their offers of cash in exchange for guidance, had violated comprehensively. Victor's second field deployment was in February of 1974. The team went into the Sikhote-Alin foothills west of Terny in the dead of the Russian Far East winter, with temperatures in the -30°C range and snow at depths of more than a meter in the higher elevations. The operational reports from that deployment document the first time anyone on Victor's team heard the animal vocalize. It happened on the fourth night out, in a temporary camp the team had established in the lee of a ridge about 8 kilometers from the nearest cleared road. Victor was on watch with the major. The two of them were sitting by the fire with their rifles across their knees, drinking tea. Innocenti was awake too in the second tent, sitting upright with his back against his pack, smoking a cigarette. The UDG guides were asleep. Victor told us he heard it first as a vibration in his sternum before he heard it with his ears. A low-frequency tone building over several seconds, somewhere east of the camp at considerable distance. The tone rose in pitch and modulated through a sequence of variations that Victor said he tried later to describe in his report and could only approximate. It was not a wolf howl. It was not a bear vocalization. It contained patterns that suggested structure, repetition, deliberate variation. It lasted perhaps 30 seconds and then it stopped. And then from somewhere to the south in the opposite direction, a second voice answered. Different pitch, different pattern, but unmistakably the same kind of sound. Communication, two of them talking across kilometers of frozen forest at 3 in the morning. In a place where Victor's team had been told there was only one animal operating in the region. The major put his hand on Victor's shoulder. The hand was shaking. The major had been on the operation since 1971. He had heard the vocalizations before. In 1972, during the summer when the team recovered the film footage. He had not heard them in winter, and he had not heard two of them answering each other. He said in a low voice that Victor could barely hear over the snap of the fire that the operation had been working on the assumption that there was perhaps one of these animals operating in the upper beacon and another, possibly the same individual, ranging into the Stanovoy. Two voices answering each other across a single kilometer of forest in February meant a breeding population. It meant there were more of them than anyone in Moscow had been prepared to accept. Innocenti came out of the second tent then. He stood at the edge of the firelight and looked east. He said in Russian that the animals had heard the team and were talking to each other about the team. He said this was not a threat. The animals were deciding whether the team was the kind of intrusion that required a response or the kind that could be tolerated. He said the choice was not his to influence. He said the team should keep the fire burning until dawn and should not leave the camp during the night for any reason. The vocalizations did not resume. In the morning, Innocenti walked a slow circle around the camp at 50 meters and came back to say that the snow showed nothing. Whatever had been calling had not approached during the night. Victor entered the incident in his journal that morning and forwarded a report to Anatoly by radio later that day. The report sits in the folder we have seen. It is dated February 22, 1974. It includes the observation, recorded in Victor's careful Russian, that the operation may have been operating since its inception under a fundamentally incorrect assumption about the size and structure of the subject population. That reconsideration would take 4 years. The team's encounters during the spring, summer, and autumn of 1974 through 1977 accumulated steadily but produced no new visual confirmations. They produced tracks. Occasional vocalizations, always at significant distance, always at night, always in patterns suggesting more than one animal communicating across territory. They produced rare physical samples, including hair and a single fragment of bone that the Academy laboratory identified as carnivore but could not place taxonomically. They produced no captures. They produced no kills. They produced mostly the slow accumulation of evidence that the operation was not hunting an animal in the normal sense, that the animal was aware of the operation, and that the conditions for an actual confrontation were being controlled by the animal, rather than by the operation. The encounter that changed Victor's life took place over a span of 3 nights in the late spring of 1978. The team had established a camp on a ridge above a small lake in the central Sikota Alin, about 40 kilometers north of Krasny Yar, in a drainage that the UDG had identified as containing a probable denning area. The team consisted of Victor, the major, 2 academy biologists, 3 other operational personnel, and 4 indigenous guides, including Inokenti. The plan was to spend 10 days at the camp, conducting passive surveillance using fixed observation posts and a network of tripwired flash cameras developed in cooperation with the Academy's instrumentation laboratory. The cameras were Soviet copies of a Czechoslovak design, modified for cold weather, set up at 14 locations along game trails and creek crossings within 3 kilometers of the camp. They were rigged to trigger when a wire was disturbed and to expose 3 frames in rapid succession before resetting. The wires were strung at varying heights from 40 centimeters off the ground up to 2 meters. The first night was uneventful. The second night, 2 cameras triggered. When the team retrieved them the following morning, 1 camera showed clear images of a brown bear walking through a wire at knee height, in 3 sequential frames that captured the animal at the beginning, middle, and end of its passage. The bear was identifiable. There was no ambiguity. The second camera on a creek crossing about 2 kilometers from the bear site had also triggered, but the film was blank. 3 frames of dark forest with no animal in any of them. Victor and one of the biologists examined the camera site carefully. The wire had been broken. The trigger mechanism had functioned. The flash had fired. But nothing was visible in the resulting images. The biologist suggested falling debris. Victor noted that the wire had been broken at 1 meter and 40 centimeters off the ground, in an area where there were no overhanging branches that could have produced debris at that specific height. On the 3rd night, 6 cameras triggered. 4 showed nothing. The wires had been broken cleanly, the flash had fired, and the resulting images were dark forest. The other 2 cameras had not produced images because the cameras themselves had been removed from their mounting positions and were not at the trigger sites when the team arrived. The mounting brackets remained. The wires remained broken. The camera bodies were gone. The team searched the surrounding terrain for the better part of the morning. They found one of the cameras 40 meters from its original position, sitting upright on a flat rock at the edge of a small meadow. Its lens cracked, but its housing otherwise intact. The other camera was never recovered. The biologists were the first to articulate what the evidence implied. Whatever had broken the wires had done so without disturbing the camera's trigger geometry in any way that would have allowed the cameras to capture an image. Either the animal had crossed the wires at angles or speeds that placed it outside the camera's fields of view between the wire break and the flash firing, which would require an understanding of the camera's optical limitations, or it had figured out how to break the wires without putting its body between the wire and the lens, which would require an even more sophisticated understanding of what the cameras were and how they worked. And it had removed 1 camera from its mounting bracket and placed it carefully on a rock 40 meters away, neither destroying it nor taking it far, in a placement the biologists could only describe as deliberate communication. The camera had been left where the team would find it. The message was that the animal understood what the cameras were for, understood that the operation had set them up, and understood that the operation would come back to retrieve them. Inokenti looked at the recovered camera for a long moment. Then he looked at Victor and said, in Russian, that the camp should be broken down and the team should leave before nightfall. He said the Lesnoy Chelovek had given the team a warning, and warnings of this kind were not repeated. He said the next thing the team would see if they remained would not be a placed camera. It would be a member of the team. Victor did not break camp. He was the operational commander, and the operation had spent 4 years and considerable resources establishing the surveillance grid in that drainage. He had a directive from Moscow to produce results. He could not abandon a camp because a guide had been frightened by an empty camera on a rock. He overruled Inokenti. He ordered the team to stay, and he ordered the deployment of the contingency plan that had been part of the operations playbook since 1972, which was to wait until nightfall and conduct an active patrol around the camp's perimeter with 2 armed officers walking a circuit at 100 meters distance from the main camp, looking for the subject and prepared to take a shot if conditions permitted. The active patrol that night was Victor and the Major. They began their circuit at 2200 hours. The moon was new. The forest under the trees was dark in the absolute way that taiga forests are dark in the absence of moonlight, which is darker than anyone who has not stood in such a forest at night can adequately imagine. The 2 of them wore white camouflage over their winter gear despite the time of year because the snow was still on the ground in the higher elevations, and the team had learned that the animal could pick out a human silhouette against snow at very long ranges. They carried Mosin carbines with telescopic sights and infrared illuminators issued by the Academy. The illuminators were primitive by modern standards, throwing a narrow beam of light at wavelengths just below the visible spectrum that lit up surfaces close to the patrol path while remaining invisible to ordinary night vision. They walked slowly. They communicated in hand signals. What they encountered about an hour into the circuit on the eastern side of the camp at a distance of perhaps 120 meters from the camp's main tent was the animal. Not a glimpse of it. Not a silhouette in motion. The animal was standing in the open on a slight rise of ground facing them. It had been waiting. The infrared illuminator showed it clearly through the carbine's scope at a range Victor estimated at 40 meters. Upright. Heavy through the shoulders, arms hanging well past the hips. A head that was unmistakably canine in profile with a long muzzle and erect pointed ears, set on a thick neck that joined the shoulders without any of the narrowing that human anatomy produces. The fur was dark, almost black under the infrared, with what looked like lighter patches on the chest and the underside of the arms. The eyes, when they caught the beam of the illuminator, threw back the amber reflection of a predator's tapetum lucidum. The Major raised his carbine. Victor told us he watched the Major raise the carbine and that he watched the animal watch the Major raise the carbine, and that the moment that followed has been with him every day for nearly 5 decades. The animal did not move. It did not flinch. It did not lower its head or shift its weight in any of the ways that prey animals do when they recognize a threat. It looked at the Major. It looked at Victor, and then, in a movement so quiet and so fast that neither of them registered it as motion until it was over, the animal stepped backward into the screen of conifers behind it and was gone. The Major did not fire. Victor asked him in a whisper why he had not fired. The Major said he could not pull the trigger. He said his hands had locked. He said he had been a soldier for 23 years. He had killed men in combat in Hungary in 1956 and again on the border with China in 1969, and he could not pull a trigger on something that was looking at him with the eyes of someone who knew what he was. The Major was shaking. Victor put a hand on his shoulder and led him back toward the camp. In the morning, the team examined the ground where the animal had stood. The impressions in the soft duff under the conifers were clear. 2 prints, perhaps 20 centimeters apart, oriented toward the patrol path. The depth and clarity of the prints indicated that the animal had stood in that position for an extended period. Inokenti examined the prints, then he walked a slow spiral outward from the spot, examining the ground, and came back to report what he had found. The animal had circled the camp during the early evening, well before the patrol began. It had positioned itself on the rise at the eastern perimeter and waited for the patrol to come to it. The choice of position, the angle of approach, the timing relative to the patrol's circuit, all of it indicated that the animal had observed the team's preparations, had inferred the patrol's likely route, and had selected a location from which it could be seen by the patrol on terms the animal controlled. Victor broke camp that morning. He led the team out of the drainage by midday. He did not file a complete report on the encounter because writing a complete report would have required acknowledging in official documentation that a Soviet operational team had encountered the subject animal at close range, had failed to capture or kill it, and had withdrawn from the field under circumstances that could only be described as the animal allowing them to leave. Anatoly, who was still in the regional administration that summer, read the abbreviated report Victor did file. He told Victor in private that they would file the encounter under unsuccessful contact and not elaborate further. The animal had been studying the operation for at least 4 years. It had developed countermeasures to the cameras. It had positioned itself to be seen by the patrol on its own terms, and it had chosen, when faced with 2 armed Soviet officers at 40 meters, to look at them and then walk away rather than to attack, to flee, or to behave in any of the ways that conventional zoology would have predicted. The 13 years that followed produced what Victor describes as the longest sustained surveillance program ever conducted on a single undocumented species by any state security apparatus in the world. The operation deployed personnel to the Sikhote Alin and the southern Stanovoy on a near-continuous rotation. It built 3 semi-permanent field stations, 2 in the Sikhote Alin foothills near the major drainages of the Upper Beacon and the Upper Iman, and a 3rd in the foothills of the Stanovoy along the Salemja River basin. It expanded the surveillance grid to nearly 70 fixed camera positions. It accumulated more than 1,400 operational reports, several thousand photographs of tracks and other physical sign, an estimated 40 hours of audio recordings of vocalizations, 3 additional 16mm film sequences of the animal at distance, and a hair and tissue sample collection that the Academy laboratory could not place but also could not dismiss. What it never accomplished was the capture or killing of even a single specimen. This is the part that needs to land. The Soviet state, at the height of its power, with the resources of the KGB and the GRU and the Academy of Sciences all directed at a single objective in a single bounded geographic area, spent 22 years trying to catch one of these animals. They had unlimited budget. They had cooperative indigenous guides, at least to the extent the guides were willing to cooperate. They had access to the best surveillance technology the Soviet defense establishment could produce. They had the legal authority to operate anywhere in the Sikhote Alin or the Stanovoy without civilian oversight. They had a population of subject animals the operation eventually estimated at between 15 and 22 individuals across the operational area. And they did not catch one. They did not kill one. They did not produce a body or a clear photograph or a piece of evidence that the Academy of Sciences could have published. The pattern that emerges from the operational reports when you read them in chronological order is not the pattern of a state security apparatus closing in on its quarry. It is the pattern of a state security apparatus being managed by its quarry. The animals understood what the operation was. They identified the locations of fixed camera positions and adjusted their movements to avoid them, or in some cases to deliberately approach them and disable the equipment without exposing themselves to the lenses. They recognized the patrol patterns of the operational personnel and avoided contact during active patrols. They appeared to distinguish between Russian personnel and indigenous guides. If you have followed DOGMAN research from any of the well-documented regions in the United States, the behavioral profile in those Russian files will look familiar. The operations reports document multiple instances in which an indigenous guide, walking alone or in a small group, encountered an animal at close range and was permitted to leave without incident. The same encounter, when it involved Russian operational personnel, resulted in either the animal's immediate withdrawal or what the operation classified as defensive demonstrations. Defensive demonstrations were behaviors the animals exhibited when Russian personnel attempted to penetrate areas the animals had identified as off-limits. They included tree breaking at heights of 3 to 4 meters off the ground, which required pulling the upper portion of a tree downward and snapping it. They included the construction of stick structures recorded in 7 separate locations, consisting of crossed branches and small saplings arranged in geometric patterns that were not the result of natural deadfall. They included vocalization sequences directed at specific patrol routes during specific time windows, often in coordination between multiple individuals. And they included, on 3 separate occasions documented in the files we have seen, the deliberate killing of Soviet Army search dogs that had been deployed in tracking attempts. The dogs were not consumed, they were not buried. They were killed with single bites to the spine in 2 cases and with what one of the operation's biologists assessed as a deliberately delivered blow to the skull in the 3rd case, and the bodies were left in positions where the operational team would find them. Always near the boundary of an area the indigenous guides had identified as a den site, always within sight of a marked tree. The message in those placements was as clear as the message in the placed camera. Victor told us that by 1985 he had come to understand the operation as a kind of slow-motion negotiation. The animals were not killing his personnel. They could have. They had demonstrated in the dog incidents that they were capable of killing trained predators with single blows. But they did not kill humans. They warned. They warned with vocalizations, with marked trees, with disabled equipment, with the bodies of search dogs left where the team would find them. And the operation, over 14 years of accumulated experience, had learned to read the warnings and to respond by withdrawing from the specific areas the animals were warning the team away from. The areas the team could operate in had been shrinking steadily since 1978. By the mid-1980s, the operation was essentially conducting passive surveillance of a perimeter that the animals had drawn, on terms the animals had set, and reporting back to Moscow that no significant operational progress had been made. Moscow was not patient with this state of affairs. Victor's reports from the early 1980s show a steady increase in pressure from the regional administration and from Moscow to produce results. There was a proposal in 1983 to introduce helicopter-borne tracking with thermal imaging equipment that the Soviet Air Force had developed for anti-tank operations. The proposal was approved at the regional level but cancelled before it was executed. After Victor and the Academy biologists wrote a joint memorandum arguing that helicopter operations would either fail to locate the subjects, who had demonstrated the ability to evade aerial detection during routine forestry overflights, or would succeed in driving the subjects out of the operational area entirely. There was also a proposal in 1984 for a coordinated capture operation with 100 personnel deployed across a defined area in a sweep formation, using armored vehicles and helicopters in support. Victor opposed this proposal in writing. He pointed out that a failed sweep operation would represent a significant expenditure of resources for which the operation would be required to provide political justification, and that he was not certain such justification could be produced. The proposal was tabled. What the operation did not document in its files, and what Victor told us only after extensive conversation, was the human cost. The operation had a turnover problem that exceeded anything the regional administration could explain to Moscow. Personnel rotated through at rates that no other comparable activity in the Far East could match. Some of the rotations were normal career movements. Many were not. Victor told us that of the personnel who served under his command between 1973 and 1991, At least 6 died by their own hand, in incidents that were officially attributed to other causes but that the operational community understood for what they were. 3 more were medically discharged for what the Soviet system classified as nervous exhaustion, and what would today be called post-traumatic stress disorder. The major from the border guards, the man who had walked the patrol with Victor in May of 1978, retired from the operation in 1981 and was diagnosed with terminal liver disease within 2 years. He drank heavily after the encounter and never stopped, and Victor told us he knew the drinking was the man's way of putting between himself and what he had seen in that drainage, a barrier that no amount of professional discipline could provide. 2 of the UDJ guides simply disappeared from the operation in 1987. They did not give notice. They did not return to Krasny Yar to be replaced. They walked into the forest one morning during a deployment in the Upper Bikin and did not come back. The operation conducted a search that lasted 3 days and found nothing. No tracks, no equipment, no bodies. Victor told us he believed the men had decided that the work they were doing was a violation of their cultural obligations to the animals, and that they had elected to remove themselves from the operation by a method the operation could not investigate further. He did not know whether they were alive or dead. The villages they came from did not discuss the matter with the operation's personnel, and Victor did not press. Innocenti died in the late winter of 1989 of pneumonia in a hospital in Khabarovsk. Victor was at his bedside on the last day. He told us Innocenti had been asking in the days before he became too sick to speak to send a message to his family in the Stanovoy foothills. The message was that he had done what he could to honor the animals while taking the operation's money, that the animals understood his position, and that he hoped they would extend the same understanding to his children. Victor delivered the message in person on a trip into the Stanovoy 3 months after Innocenti's funeral. The family received it in silence. They served Victor tea. They asked him no questions. He told us he never went back. The operation was wound down in the spring and summer of 1991 as the Soviet Union itself was winding down. The order came through the regional administration on March 20th, with a deadline of August 31st for the closure of all field activities and the transfer of operational materials to the Khabarovsk archive. The order was unsigned at the highest levels, which Victor told us he understood to mean that nobody in Moscow wanted their name on the file. The operation had not produced a captured specimen, had not produced a publishable scientific paper, had not produced anything that the Soviet state could use to justify the 22 years of expenditure committed to it. The state itself was dissolving. The Soviet Union ended in December of that year. The operation had ended 4 months earlier, with a stack of files transferred to a regional archive and a small group of officers, biologists, and indigenous guides walking away from 22 years of work that nobody in the new Russia was going to read. Except 30 years later, a graduate student found the folder. What the files describe is a population of intelligent canid predators occupying a defined territory in the eastern Russian taiga, with social organization, communication systems, territorial protocols, and an apparent understanding of human technology and human institutional behavior that no known animal matches. The population is small. The operation's final estimate in its close-out report dated August 8, 1991, placed the operational area population at between 15 and 22 individuals, distributed across approximately 150,000 square kilometers of central and northern Sikhote-Alin and the southern Stanovoy. Whether the population extends further north and east into the great empty stretches of Yakutia and Magadan, where the older Yakut and even traditions describe related creatures under different names, is a question the operation never had the resources to address. The behavioral profile that emerges from the operations reports is consistent in nearly every detail with what Linda Godfrey documented across 3 decades of research into North American dogman encounters. Nocturnal preference but not exclusivity. Territorial marking through tree damage and what may be deliberate stick arrangements. Vocalizations with structured patterns, including coordinated calls between individuals across kilometers of terrain. Coordinated group behavior. Camera and surveillance equipment awareness, with documented behaviors that imply understanding of what the equipment does and how to disable it. Strategic restraint, with humans permitted to leave dangerous territory rather than being attacked when attack was clearly possible. An association with water sources, ridgelines, and remote areas with minimal human presence. And a deep historical embedding in the oral traditions of the indigenous peoples of the operational region. Traditions that consistently describe a creature matching the operational report's description, and that consistently prescribe protocols for human-creature interaction that the indigenous peoples follow, and that the operation, in violating, paid the price for in 22 years of failed engagement. The Steve Cook song from 1987, which began as an April Fool's Day prank on a radio station in Traverse City, Michigan, and which has since become the unofficial anthem of the North American dogman research community, references a 10-year cycle of dogman sightings in the upper Midwest. The American 1887 Wexford County encounter, in which 2 lumberjacks in the Michigan logging camps along the Manistee River reported seeing a creature with a man's body and a dog's head, was filed at the same time the Russian imperial government was establishing its first administrative posts in what is now Primorsky Krai. 2 regions on opposite sides of the world, both with deep canopies of boreal and temperate forest, both with indigenous traditions describing the same creature. The American researchers have spent 30 years building the case that what witnesses are describing is a real animal. The Soviet state spent 22 years operating from the assumption that it was real, with all the resources of a superpower directed at proving it. Both approaches converge on the same conclusion. What the files mean for those of us reading them now from outside Russia is that the dogman phenomenon documented by Linda Godfrey and other researchers across North America is not a North American phenomenon. It is a circumpolar phenomenon. It is documented across the boreal and temperate forests of the Northern Hemisphere, in indigenous traditions that predate any of the political boundaries we currently use to organize the world, and in modern state security files that have begun to surface as the secrecy regimes of the 20th century continue their slow erosion. The animal exists. It exists in numbers small enough to evade casual detection and large enough to maintain breeding populations across multiple continents. It is intelligent enough to manage its interactions with human institutions, to evade capture by sustained state effort, and to communicate its territorial boundaries with sufficient clarity. That the indigenous peoples who share its territory have built functional protocols for coexistence over thousands of years. The American researchers who have spent careers documenting individual encounters. The Soviet officers who spent careers trying to catch one. The Udege and Nanai and Evenki and Yakut elders who have been telling their grandchildren about the Lesnoi Chelevek and the Chuchuna for as long as their languages have existed, are all describing the same phenomenon. The difference between them is methodological. The methodology that has worked best is the indigenous one. Acknowledge the animal. Respect its territory. Do not pursue it. Do not bring cameras or weapons or institutional ambitions into its forests with the intention of using them against the animal. The Udege and Nanai did not need to capture the Lesnoi Chelevek to know it was there. They knew because their ancestors knew, and the ancestors' knowledge was preserved in the protocols of daily life, in the way one moved through certain valleys and not others, in the way one did not raise one's voice after dark in certain seasons, in the way one left certain trees alone and did not interfere with certain ridgelines. The knowledge worked. The animal stayed. The people stayed. The forest stayed. Victor lives now in a small town in the Urals, far from the country where the operation took place. He retired from the FSB, the successor agency to the KGB, in 2004. He told us he requested the transfer out of the Far East in 1993 after 2 years of trying to continue some version of the work under the new Russian Federation's bureaucratic structures, and realizing that the political conditions of the early Yeltsin era would not support it. He spent the rest of his career in administrative work in Moscow and then in the Urals, marrying a woman whose first husband had died in Afghanistan and raising her 2 children as his own. He never had children of his own, by choice. He told us he had not wanted to bring children into a family where the father carried what he carried, which he could not share and which he could not put down. What he wants, now that the files are out and a portion of them are in the hands of researchers outside Russia, is for the operation's evidence to be evaluated by people with the time and the freedom to evaluate it on its merits. He knows what the Russian state security apparatus would do if it became aware that he had spoken to us. He knows that the political conditions in Russia today are even less hospitable to disclosures about historical KGB operations than they were in the mid-1990s, when the brief opening of the archives produced the first wave of documented Soviet-era research material. He also knows that he is in his 80s, that his health is uncertain, and that what he carries from 22 years in the Sikote Alin will not survive him if he does not find a way to put it where someone might eventually use it. He told us he chose this channel because his late wife's son, who lives in Berlin, watches the channel and has been after Victor for years to find a way to tell the story. He said his stepson has been more of a son than most biological children manage, and Victor decided that if a man's stepson was telling him to talk, then a man should talk while there was still time. The files we have seen are a portion of what was transferred to the Khabarovsk archive in 1991. We do not know how much of the original material remains in that archive. Victor told us he believed the majority of the operational materials were transferred to Khabarovsk, but that certain categories of material, including the original 16mm film footage and the hair and tissue samples, were transferred to a different facility, whose name and location he was no longer comfortable disclosing because the facility may still exist. He believed those materials were probably still in Russian government custody, somewhere in a state of bureaucratic limbo identical to the one that protected the Khabarovsk folder for 30 years until a graduate student happened to pull the wrong file. What that means in practical terms is that the Soviet state's 22-year investigation of the Lesnoy Chelovek of the Eastern Taiga produced a body of evidence that almost certainly still exists in fragments scattered across the archival infrastructure of the former Soviet Union. Some of it is what we have seen. Some of it is what other researchers may yet find. And some of it almost certainly is gone forever, lost in the chaotic transfers of the early 1990s or quietly destroyed by officials of the new Russian state who understood that certain Soviet legacies were better not preserved. The animal itself is presumably still there. The Sikote Alin remains one of the largest intact temperate forests in the world. The Beacon National Park, established in 2015 on the watershed that was the heart of the operation's original surveillance grid, now protects more than 1 million hectares of the Upper Beacon from logging and industrial development, in part as a refuge for the indigenous Udege and Nanai people whose ancestors taught Victor's team everything the team ever actually learned about the country. The park is also, by every credible inference from the operation's files, a refuge for the animals the operation spent 2 decades trying to capture. The Udege and the Nanai know they are there. The Russian state, in its current configuration, has no operational interest in confirming or denying the presence of an animal that the Soviet state spent 22 years failing to catch. Victor told us on our final call that he thinks about the encounter at the camp above the lake in 1978 more often now than he did in the years immediately after. He said the memory has clarified over time rather than fading. He said he can still see the animal at 40 meters in the green wash of the infrared illuminator looking at him and at the major. He said he understands now in a way he did not understand at 28 what the animal was telling them. It was telling them that it could have killed them. It was telling them that it knew what they were carrying and what those carbines could do at 40 meters, and that it did not care. It was telling them that the operation was not going to succeed, that the territory was not theirs to control, and that the only reason they were going to be permitted to walk back to the camp was that the animal had decided, for reasons that belonged to the animal and not to the team, that killing them would create more problems than it would solve. It was, Victor said, the closest thing to a conversation with another mind he had ever experienced. And the message of that conversation was that he was not at the top of the food chain anywhere in those forests, and that the polite thing for him to do was to acknowledge the fact and leave. He acknowledged it. He left. He spent the next 13 years of his career going through the motions of an operation he knew could not succeed, because his country required him to go through the motions. And he carried for the rest of his working life and into his retirement the knowledge that the Soviet state in its full strength had been managed by a population of animals in a forest the state could not control, and that the failure had been so complete that the state itself had ended before the operation did. The most striking thing in the files, the detail Victor came back to in both of our conversations, is something he mentioned almost in passing when he was describing the encounter at 40 meters. He said that the animal, in the long moment it looked at him through the green light of the infrared illuminator, made a sound, not a vocalization, a small sound deep in its throat that Victor could not hear from the distance, but that he could see in the slight movement of the animal's chest and the shape of its open mouth. The major, who was the closer of the two of them, told Victor afterward that he had heard the sound. He said it was not a growl, it was not a warning. He said it sounded like a sigh. The kind of sigh a man makes when he is dealing with something he has been dealing with for a long time and would prefer to be done with it, and knows that he is not going to be done with it tonight, and accepts the situation and waits for it to pass. The major said the animal had sighed at them, as if it were tired, as if their presence in the forest after nearly a decade of dealing with their presence in the forest was simply one more thing it was going to have to wait out. As if the operation and the Soviet state and the long stretch of human industry in those mountains were all simply weather that an old animal had learned to endure. The operation failed because it did not understand what that sigh meant. The Soviet state failed for many reasons, but among them was its inability to understand that some things in its territory were not subject to its authority. The animals in the Sikote Aline are still there. The forest in which they live is being slowly returned to the kind of indigenous management that worked for 10,000 years before the operation began. Victor will die soon. He knows it. He told us so without melodrama. He is in his early 80s. He has had 2 heart attacks in the last decade. His health is what it is. He has put the story of the operation, in the form that he was willing to put it, into our hands. He has done what he set out to do. When we asked him at the end of our final conversation whether there was anything he wanted to add, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, in the careful Russian we had grown used to over the course of the calls, that he hoped the people who heard this story would understand that the animal was not a monster. He said the animal was older than the state that had hunted it, and wiser than the men who had served the state, and that the proper response to the existence of such an animal was not fear but humility. He said his greatest regret about the operation was not the colleagues he had lost, though he regretted them deeply, and not the years of work he had spent on a project that produced no usable scientific result. though he regretted that too. His greatest regret was that he had not, in the moment when the animal looked at him through the infrared light, found a way to apologize for his presence. He said the apology would not have changed anything. The animal already knew, but he wished he had offered it. The folder is real, the files are real, the animal is real. The forest where it lives is one of the last great forests left in the world, and the people who share it with the animal have been telling us, for as long as we have been listening, that the animal is what they say it is. The Soviet state spent 22 years finding out the hard way that they were right. The rest of us have the option of taking their word for it. If you have ever stood at the edge of a deep forest after dark, anywhere in the world, and felt the particular kind of stillness that means something is aware of you that you cannot see, what you felt was not your imagination. It was the older language of the world, telling you what you needed to know. The Soviet officers who spent 22 years in the Sikhote Alin learned to read that language. The Udega and the Nanai and the Evenki had been reading it for 10,000 years. The animal has been speaking it for longer than that. We are, all of us, late to the conversation. The most useful thing we can do is sit down quietly and listen.